Today we're going to be doing a webinar on God, evolution, and Darwinism. So thank you for joining us. This is going to be an academic seminar. I'm looking forward to your questions, inshallah. And one of the most important aspects of Darwinian theory is its implications theologically, which is what we're going to be looking at today. To start off with, I'm going to be referring to data which is not from the creationist intelligent design movement. It's going to be secular, mainstream people who believe in naturalism, and I'm going to be referring to peer-reviewed journals. The first thing I'd like to highlight, Darwin's theory is a valid scientific model, theory, and paradigm. It is not something which I'm going to be saying is pseudoscientific. It is not something which I'm going to be putting forward as something not valid from a scientific perspective. I believe the way that Philip Johnson, who is a critic of Darwinism, put it, that Darwinism is the best naturalistic explanation that we have of life. Now, look at the words, best naturalistic explanation, okay? From that perspective, then Darwinism is a valid scientific model. However, something being valid from a scientific perspective does not mean it is true. Now, this is something very important to keep in mind. It's a profound point which a lot of people miss out on. They believe by calling something scientific, we are calling it to be true. But there is no link between the scientific success of a theory and its necessary truth value. This is something we can go into in the Q&A. However, this is a big misunderstanding about the theory. What comes to mind when you look at this image? You would think of gradualistic evolution. You'd think of evolution from a progress point of view. The first thing I'd like to shatter is the idea that evolution is about progress. It's not about progress. It's about survival. As long as something survives and reproduces, it is, from an evolutionary perspective, successful. So success from an evolutionary perspective is not to do with becoming bigger, better, smarter, more egalitarian, liberal values. No, that is not success. Success is simply survival and reproduction. This is one of the misunderstandings of evolutionary theory. So let's start off with this idea that evolution as a theory is set in stone. There's something very interesting the Professor Richard Dawkins from Oxford University says in his book, A Devil's Chaplain. We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. Now, what's important here to see is that Dawkins is referring to Darwinism. He's not referring here to evolution. And he's mentioning that new facts may come to light which will force our successors, which here he's referring to the problem of induction, as it's known in the philosophy of science. The problem of induction is pretty simple. You make observations based upon the data that you have. So, for example, you notice 100 swans, which are white. You make the assumption that the next swan is going to be white, or all swans are white. This is known as induction. But the problem of induction is you may come across a black swan, which means that your theory is incorrect. So here, he's pointing out to something pretty obvious, which is that science can change and something you believe to be correct today can turn out to be wrong in the future. And we know this through the history of science. So there's nothing controversial that he is saying here. And Darwin himself pointed out the fact that his theory could be challenged, as in the data that was used to create the theory, the same data could be used to create another theory, a rival theory, an alternative theory, because the data doesn't necessarily lead to one conclusion. This is what he says. I am well aware that there is scarcely a single point discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts, both sides of each question, and this cannot possibly be done here. So again, what we find is this type of intellectual humility from Darwin, that his theory is not the only theory possible based upon the data. So what's the difference between evolution and Darwinism? The first thing to keep in mind is that evolution is simply the concept of biological change over time. Species evolve and change. The organisms on Earth today are different to those in the past. We have biological change happening over time. Darwinism is the far greater claim that all life on Earth originated with one common ancestor, and that common ancestor, known as Luca, the last universal common ancestor, is the ancestor of all living beings. That means you as a Homo sapien, that means an elephant, a blade of grass, a bumblebee, a cat. All of them go back to one common ancestor. And this is through the mechanism of natural selection, working on random mutations. So that is the mechanism of evolution. So there's two different things to keep in mind here. Darwinism is a particular claim about the history of evolution, which is shown as a tree of life, and the mechanism of that evolution, which is natural selection working on random mutations. So that's the difference between evolution and Darwinism. Now, obviously, evolution is true. Evolution is observable. Evolution is based on evidence. Darwinism is a particular claim about the history of evolution, and a particular claim about the mechanism of evolution, and that is not something we can give the same weight as the biological concept of evolution. So Darwinism is the theory, evolution is the observable fact, and Darwinism is not something we can say to be absolutely true. So the idea that you get human beings evolving from a common ancestor with a chimpanzee, that is a Darwinian concept. That is not a simply evolutionary concept, because you can have evolutionary models without human beings and chimpanzees having a common ancestor, like Lamarck came up with those ideas. So let's go over to some definitions. Evolution simply means biological change over time. Darwinism, or Darwinian evolution, or neo-Darwinism, is referring to the tree of life plus natural selection. So it's the history of evolution and it's the mechanism of evolution. Micro and macro evolution can be problematic terms, so let's not use them for the sake of this webinar. Now, methodological naturalism is an assumption governing the scientific research method. Methodological naturalism underlines the way that you are supposed to work as a scientist. What it's basically saying is this: you do not allow any supernatural explanations when you're looking at the world. You assume everything can be broken down to the natural. Natural here means physical. It means something physical. Physical matter, physical processes. No God, no soul, no immaterial mind. This assumption, now remember, this is not a conclusion. This is an assumption. This assumption entails certain biological conclusions. The primary conclusion being there is no design. There is no independent ancestry. All of creation goes back to one universal common ancestor, and there is no purpose to life except procreation. Now, let's look at the way that biologists have understood methodological naturalism and the implications it actually has. Francis Crick won the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA, the double helix structure that we have. He says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So you can have a look at this sophisticated, novel organism. You can look at a feature of the organism. You can try and look at the design of it, as long as you do not attribute the design to God, you attribute it to natural selection. You believe that it evolved via natural processes, and that's fine. It doesn't matter how sophisticated it looks. It doesn't matter how simple how simple inferences will show us that this is actually designed, and how this looks similar to perhaps human design of certain features like an engine. Doesn't matter. It is not designed because of methodological naturalism. No separate ancestry. So imagine there is an atheist on an island, and they are born on the island, never communicated with any human beings. They've never read any science books. They just need to use their mind to come up with the conclusion of how life began and where all creatures come from. So this atheist will look at grass, we'll look at beetles, we'll look at the trees, we'll look at the elephants, we'll look at the giraffes, we'll look at the fish, we'll look at the snakes, we'll look at the reptiles, we'll look at all these things, and they would make the assumption that going back, there must have been simpler organisms before them, and going back must have been simpler organisms before them, going back to one simple organism. Where did that come from? Some sort of chance process. They cannot say that all this complexity arose because of design, because they don't believe in God. So the first problem they have to deal with is make design less, make complexity less, make specified complexity less. So they need to take all this complexity and try and simplify it by saying the history of life gets simpler and simpler and simpler. But the problem is, we know that the first cell was incredibly complex. The first cell was complex. So this assumption is actually wrong. But if they're an atheist, they have to make that assumption. Another way that Richard Lewontin puts it, who passed away now, but he was a prominent Harvard biologist, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What is he saying here? He's saying it is an a priori assumption of science that there is no God. And no matter how counterintuitive our conclusions are, we cannot allow any supernatural explanations in the realm of science. So this is another way that we can understand methodological naturalism. So this image is actually not representing anything that any serious biologist holds on to. We do not believe we evolved from pigs. However, if someone was to put together the idea that human beings evolved from a pig-like ancestor, that's way more likely to be accepted as science than the idea that human beings were created ex nihilo, from nothing, because it's not naturalistic. Now, you may have a biologist who's in front of a class and he is explaining that whether the human being is looked at it from a biological perspective, genetic perspective, morphological perspective, psychological perspective, whether we look at bioinformatics, we look at paleontology, we look at anthropology, all of these fields leads to the conclusion that Darwinism is true. This is what they would say. Yet, what we can say at minimum is, even if all these scientific fields were to converge without any anomalies, and there's plenty of anomalies, if they were to arrive without anomalies and they were to actually present all this evidence, we can still say at least three things about the state of Darwinism. The first is that it's based on a probabilistic framework. The second is that it has multiple assumptions. And the third is that there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. So working out the history of life from an anthropological perspective is incredibly difficult. It's very difficult. And one of the ways that it's been this issue has been raised by Holden is to try and work out the plot of War and Peace with only 13 randomly selected pages. Imagine you have Leo Tolstoy's book War and Peace, and you've never read the book before. You open up the book, the whole book is blank. Page 1 is blank, page 2 is blank, page 3 is blank, page 1000 is blank. However, in this blank book, 13 pages are not blank. They're randomly selected and they're there. Now, can you use those 13 pages to put together the rest of the book? Very unlikely. If you give this to book with 13 randomly selected pages to 1,000 people, they'll come up with 1,000 different narratives. That's how difficult it is to work out the history of life on Earth. One of the pieces of data that we have from the National Science Foundation is 99.999% of the data is missing. So any conclusions that we make are likely to be very probabilistic in their nature. So you can come up with all types of descriptions for the history of life on Earth, universal common ancestry, hedge of life, web of life, gradualism, rapid evolutionary changes, Lamarckian, non-Lamarckian, whatever you make is probabilistic and open to interpretations. It's like a scatter graph of data on steroids. This is Richard Lewontin, who I referred to earlier, referring to the methodological naturalism as an assumption in science. And one of the things he points out is that biological stories about the origin of certain features in organisms are made up. They're just so stories. So Rudyard Kipling, the author, he wrote these famous children books. And one of the things he wrote is, for example, the elephant, how does it get such a long trunk? Well, the crocodile was biting it, trying to drag it into the water, it was fighting, so then it had a long trunk. These are just stories that may be consistent, stories that may make sense, but they're not based on any evidence. And there's no reason for us to actually believe them. So he says the stories that we find in the biological literature about color evolution, about, all these different types of evolution, people like Lewontin believe these are just so stories. Raymond Tallis gives the example of color evolution. So we have the case where in the West, men generally like the color blue more than women. Women like the color red. So there is a story that why do men like the color blue? Well, the men who like the color blue were more likely to survive, because if they had the genetic dispositions to like the color blue, then they would be more likely to survive because the sky is blue, the river is blue, and they go out for hunting. It's going to be helping them survive. Women, likewise, if they have a genetic disposition to like the color red, are more likely to survive because they are cutting meat, they are picking berries, and so on and so forth. Anyway, Raymond Tallis, he challenges this just so story by saying, well, men liking the color blue and women liking the color red is a pretty European-centric way of looking at the world. It's not true in other parts of the world. I've traveled to Africa, and I can tell you the men in Africa, they sometimes wear very, very bright red colors. So, and you get this in other parts of the world, in Asia and Philippines and other places, you get all types of cultures, all types of people, all types of a myriad of the way that people can actually put together their attire in different color schemes. So it doesn't matter. We can't use this Eurocentric way of looking at color and then come up with a scientific theory. But he says even in Europe, this wasn't actually true. In the Victorian times, men liked the color red, and women liked the color blue, which is why Alice in Wonderland you get in blue, and you also get men who prefer the color red during that period. So there's a difference between what's theoretically plausible and what actually happened. Just so stories are given to us as theoretical possibilities, it doesn't mean that's the way that science actually functions. Okay, let's look into another important aspect, which is that of homology. So homology is pointed out as a very strong piece of evidence that we have a universal common ancestor with the chimpanzee, and generally all of life on Earth evolved from one universal common ancestor. The main argument for this is homology, which is similarities due to common descent. Now, similarities do not necessarily entail common ancestry. Similarities could be down to common design. Similarities could be down to common evolutionary pathways, which is what we have here. So we have homoplasy, which is what Darwinists admit is morphological similarities, physiological similarities, anatomical similarities, which are not due to common ancestry. Rather, they are due to common evolutionary trajectories. And the marsupial saber-toothed tiger is a excellent example of that. Okay. The way that the philosopher Ronald Brady broke down the problem of homology is in the following ways. By making our explanation into the definition of the condition to be explained, we express not scientific hypothesis, but belief. We are so convinced that our explanation is true that we no longer see any need to distinguish it from the situation we're trying to explain. Dogmatic endeavors like this must eventually leave the realm of science. The problem is, those who say homology is true, they are either in a position where they are unjustified because it's an assumption, or it's a tautology. It's a tautology as in they're saying the same thing. So I'll give you an example of a tautology. Look on the right at the box. Number one, similarities are due to common descent. Number two, similarities exist, therefore common descent. Read that again. Similarities are due to common descent. Similarities exist, therefore common descent. What is the problem here? The problem is the first premise and the last conclusion is the same thing. It's actually the same thing. The premise and the conclusion is the same thing. How ridiculous is that? That is a tautology. That is circular reasoning. And that is exactly what some Darwinists are guilty of. So there's a problem. Not only is it the case that homology is either unjustified or tautology, we have the quagmire of homoplasy. So we have the wings of a bird, the wings of a bat. Is that due to common ancestry? No. That's due to homoplasy, common evolutionary trajectories. We have echolocation in a bat, echolocation in a whale. Is that due to common ancestry? No. The genetic data that you need and the anatomy that you need for echolocation, in the case of the bat, in the case of the whale, is not due to common ancestry. So what I'm pointing out is that there's nothing categorical either way. That's what I'm really pointing at. I'm not saying the Darwinists don't have an argument. I'm saying they may have an argument, but the argument's based on assumptions within a probabilistic framework. The way Elliot Sober, the philosopher, explains it in Evidence and Evolution is, both of the following thoughts are naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they're so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. Now we're going to move on to assumptions. So Darwin was pretty honest about some problems with his theory, and this is directly from The Origin of Species. Long before having arrived at this part of my work, a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to the reader. Some of them are so grave that to this day, I can hardly reflect on them without being staggered. But to the best of my judgment, the great number are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to my theory. So what we find in Darwin is a type of humility and honesty that we don't find in the likes of Dawkins. Here are some assumptions to keep in mind. Gradualism, tree of life, and the selfish gene concept. Now, Darwin believed his theory had to be steady, slow, and continuous in order for it to actually hold. And he believed if there could be any organism which is shown to be irreducibly complex, then his theory would absolutely break down. And he was explicitly clear about this. He was clear that his theory would break down if gradualism was challenged. And that's exactly what happened. We found that the fossil record did not show gradualism. The fossil record showed organisms staying the same for a long period of time and then rapid changes. So this model, known as punctuated equilibrium, this idea that you have stasis, you have organisms remaining the same, conserved for a while, and then you have this massive change. This is, again, something which doesn't fit Darwinian theory. The tree of life is another assumption of Darwinism, but biologists now are speaking about the web of life as opposed to a tree of life. The selfish gene perspective is that we are survival machines, robot vehicles, blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is the truth which still fills me with astonishment. This is what Dawkins is basically saying. And what we find is that human beings are not at rock bottom selfish. We do care. We are compassionate. We are kind. So how do they explain us not being selfish? They have two theories to try and explain that: kin selection and reciprocal altruism. Kin selection is you don't really care about other people, but you do care about your kin. You care about your brother and your sister because they carry your genes. So if you help them, you're helping yourself. That's kin selection. Reciprocal altruism is you don't really care about people, but if you help them, they're going to help you. Both of these theories break down because each one of us gives charity to people who we're not related to and people who are not going to be able to give us help back. So clearly, reciprocal altruism and kin selection do not explain how human beings are kind and compassionate and sympathetic and altruistic. It simply is empty in its explanatory power. Another key aspect of the human experience, which cannot be explained from a Darwinian perspective, is our existential crises. What is life about? We're told from the time that we were fish all the way to the time that we were mammals, we were eating, surviving, and reproducing. Yet we care about these deep philosophical questions. Why? That's the question. Why? If we simply evolved rather to survive and reproduce, why are we getting involved in these deep discussions? According to some, a lot of the assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproven. Now, the Darwinian history and the Darwinian mechanism you can think of as a bridge. The Darwinian history is the actual beam, the actual road, and the mechanism is the pillars on either side. If the mechanism breaks, if natural selection working on random mutations breaks, then the history is also questionable. Some Darwinists are trying to separate out the history from the mechanism. but the history cannot be separated from the mechanism. It's like H2O. What is water? H2O. Likewise, the Darwinian history of life, the tree of life, and the mechanism of natural selection are linked, intertwined. You cannot separate them. Lastly, we're going to go over disputes when it comes to Darwinian evolution. We have the likes of James Shapiro with natural genetic engineering, neo-Lamarckian models being proposed by Eva Jablanka, mutation-driven evolution by Masayoshi Nai. These are alternatives to the Darwinian explanation for life. And these alternatives challenge the base assumptions of Darwinian theory. Now, these alternatives are not known by the public. These alternatives are not understood by the public. And that's why it's important to show that not only is Darwinism based on a probabilistic framework and has assumptions, there are key disputes about the theory that we have to recognize. Now, the third way of evolution is a project put together by biologists and people who do not subscribe to the Darwinian paradigm. They here on their website, the third way of evolution, third way of referring here to not intelligent design and not Darwinism, a third way, they have published their books and their papers, and the scientists from all across the world that subscribe to this perspective. Let's read their statement. The vast majority of people believe that there are only two alternative ways to explain the origins of biological diversity. One way is creationism that depends upon the intervention of a divine creator. That is clearly unscientific, here referring to methodological naturalism, because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force into the evolutionary process. The commonly accepted alternative is neo-Darwinism, which is clearly naturalistic science but ignores much of the contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of hereditary variation. Neo-Darwinism ignores important rapid evolutionary processes such as symbiogenesis, horizontal DNA transfer, action on mobile DNA, and epigenetic modifications. Moreover, some Darwinists have elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems without a real empirical basis. Many scientists today see the need for a deeper and more complete exploration of all aspects of the evolutionary process. So we can clearly see there are massive disputes when it comes to Darwinian theory. The last thing I'd like to highlight is Darwinism is not just a theory. Darwinism is more than a theory. It's a secular religious perspective. It's an alternative to traditional religion. And this is not just me saying this. You can see this in the writing of Darwinists, their perspective on Darwinian evolution. Richard Dawkins writes in The Blind Watchmaker, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So you can clearly see he is taking theological implications of the theory. And if Darwinists are to make the genetic fallacy of challenging intelligent design proponents because they believe in God, then the door swings both ways. We can challenge people like Richard Dawkins and say maybe your atheism has a role to play in the way that you understand Darwinian theory or you propagate it. Likewise, the atheist author and historian Yuval Noah Harari says, there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. Again, he is coming up with non-scientific implications of the scientific theory of Darwinism. So clearly it is more than just science. Michael Roos, well-known atheist Darwinist, he's written a book called Darwinism as Religion, in which he makes the same point of Darwinism being a religious, secular religious perspective. Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, likewise a atheist and Darwinist, he wrote a book, Revelation Without Religion, here referring to evolutionary humanism, Darwinism as a religion which is there as a replacement to traditional religions like Christianity and Islam. There's sociological pressure within academia to conform. We have people like Masayoshi Nai, who've spoken about this curtailment of freedom of speech to challenge Darwinism. He says Darwin is a god in biology and he can't be challenged. And, he has very strong views against the way that academia operates, with Darwinism prevailing, and Lynn Margulis, who calls neo-Darwinism an Anglo-Saxon religion. And she won the National Prize in America for Science. Both of these scientists are secular atheist scientists, yet they recognize Darwinism is having a negative impact on the freedom of speech within academia. Just to summarize, Darwinian evolution is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions that there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. It is still a valid scientific theory. It's the prevailing paradigm. It's the best explanation from a naturalistic perspective, but it doesn't mean it's true. And lastly, it's not just a theory. It is also a secular religious perspective. I hope you've enjoyed this live stream in which I've covered God and evolution and the general state of Darwinism. My favorite section is always the Q&A. So I look forward to your questions. You can unmute your mic and ask a question, or you can leave a question in the chat below. Jazakallah khair.